Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's first segment, we're going to discuss the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's decision to not sign the deal that has been reached with the Taliban so far. That's according to all senior officials, even of the United States, Afghanistan, and European officials as well. Is this an indication possibly of how risky this pact may be overall? Or what's really happening behind the scenes, considering the fact that if the U.S. is nervous, or the U.S. Secretary of State, I should say, is nervous about putting down his signature on a document which officially recognizes the Taliban, then why is the U.S. in the first place negotiating with the Taliban? Isn't that sort of a paradoxical stance? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Isidor, Coma, who conducts research and analysis on U.S. national security and defense strategies at the Center for Analysis of Foreign Policy and International Security of Catalonia. He's joining us now from Barcelona. We're also joined by Zubair Babakarkhail, who is a journalist, and he is joining us now from Kabul. Zubair and Isidor, thank you both for joining us. Isidor, I'd like to start with you. What do you think is behind Pompeo's nervousness about signing this deal at this time?
Well, thanks for having me. We are still missing a lot of details about the agreement, so we cannot talk about with a lot of confidence. But we know for sure that in any case, this agreement would force the Taliban to talk in good faith with the Afghan government. So this is a really important point. It does not put an end to terrorism. We saw 2 weeks ago that there were still having attacks in Kabul. And also, it probably doesn't cover which are going to be the compliance mechanisms that would be put in place if the agreement was to be signed. For the Trump administration, the worst case scenario is to see Afghanistan turning into Libya once they retreat from there. So it's really, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why the Trump administration should not yet sign the agreement.
Zubair, I wonder what your thoughts are on that there. In Afghanistan itself, what are the conversations there like about this deal? Does it go far enough? Does it appease the Afghan government of Ashraf Ghani enough?
Yeah, that's one of the other reasons I wanted to mention that U.S. Foreign Secretary is concerned about it, because in the document, the Taliban still doesn't try to understand that they are going to talk with the Afghan government. They are not calling it an Afghan government. They say with Afghan sides or Afghan politicians. So in Afghanistan, peoples plus the government, they all are concerned about this document, which is shared with the Afghan president, and they said it might not help the second round of the discussions, because it's not clear in the document that the Taliban in the next round, they are going to directly start negotiations with President Ghani or his people.
Isidor, I wonder what you make of the domestic U.S. context for all of this, because, we've had 9 rounds of discussion with the Taliban, at least, in Qatar. And then we've had 18 years or plus of war in that country, in which the U.S.-led alliance has been involved. A lot of money has been spent. The U.S. public is seemingly not on the side of continuing this, obviously, forever. And we have the 2020 U.S. elections coming up very quickly as well. So all of that puts a lot of pressure, doesn't it, on Donald Trump, who came in on a platform of not remaining in never-ending wars around the world. How important is that context, do you think?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right with all these points. The situation for Trump is really complicated. As you said, the war has been ongoing for almost 19 years. So everything that is not a stable regime means very little progress. And Trump wants at all costs to avoid leaving the country in a worse situation that the one it was found. So they are scared about that. For sure, the elections are gonna deal with foreign policy, and he wants to show that he has been doing better than Bush and especially Obama. And this will be impossible if he cannot deliver on better results in Afghanistan. They want to leave the country for sure. Trump has always said he wants to leave the country. He wants to show that he's better than other former presidents, but he's trapped there. He knows. Let's think that the worst case scenario for him would be to start sending troops back home and then being forced to send them back because the situation has gone out of hand. So I fully support the statement that a number of former ambassadors to Afghanistan, U.S. ambassadors to Afghanistan, did to a letter to Atlantic Council in which they said that although this has been the closest that we have been to a peace agreement, it is not sure that peace can be reached yet. And any withdrawal of forces should follow the peace agreement, not come in advance to it.
Let me add another voice to this conversation. We're joined now by Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He's joining us now from Washington itself. Michael, good morning, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Michael, what are your thoughts about the kind of political pressure that Donald Trump finds himself under right now when it comes to Afghanistan? And whether that, do you think, will force Ashraf Ghani's hand there in Kabul to possibly just accept this, even though he quite strongly seemingly disagrees with this pact?
Well, I do think there is considerable pressure on Trump and his administration to get Afghanistan wrapped up in some manner or fashion. But I think that it's a self-imposed pressure. Donald Trump campaigned on this during the 2016 campaign. It wasn't that big an issue. It's not the reason why Donald Trump was elected, but for various reasons, he finds himself in a tight race for re-election. Of course, the election is not for another 14 months, but he finds himself in a tight race for re-election, and he's going through the checklist of how many things can I say that I promised during the campaign can I accomplish. This is one of the things that he hasn't accomplished. He hasn't been able to get the United States out of Afghanistan, and so he finds himself under self-imposed pressure. It's that kind of pressure.
You're saying it's self-imposed, Michael, but I wonder, though, the U.S. public, from all the reports I've seen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the U.S. public really wants this all to end because this is essentially taking a lot of money to continue this involvement there in Afghanistan. I imagine officials too are not too happy to be continually writing these checks for that involvement to continue. That's separate from just Donald Trump, isn't it? I mean, that's a reality as well, isn't it?
Yes. The American public is generally not supportive of continued activity in Afghanistan. And as you point out, one of the reasons is the tremendous cost that our footprint there continues to suck out of our annual budget. The second reason is the casualties. We've had 3 casualties in the last couple of weeks as we're supposedly negotiating with the Taliban. And was it yesterday or the day before when yet another American serviceman was killed and the Taliban took credit for it? So these two things together are leading the American people not to be supportive of what's going on. But I don't think that lack of support is necessarily permanent. If the president would use some political capital and go out and make the case as to why we need to continue to have a presence in Afghanistan, I think he could change the public opinion of his base of support. But he doesn't want to do that. His inclination is to get out. His inclination is to keep his promise. His inclination is to save the money and avoid the casualties. And I believe that's the direction in which he's going to take us.
Okay, so Isidor, I'm going to ask you a simple question. Do you think the U.S. should remain in Afghanistan for longer? Do you think that this is all being rushed a bit at this point? Because again, as I put to you in the first question, this has continued for so many years. What more can happen now for a different result to come out?
Yeah, I think basically the decision is about choosing between the lesser evil. And I think right now the lesser evil is to stay in Afghanistan until, you have an assurance that you're going to leave something behind that is better than the situation that that President Trump found in 2017. The whole peace agreement, everything that has been included in the talks, has been based on trust between the U.S. government and the Taliban, who are still not even officially recognized. So, if we have anything in Afghanistan, if we are missing anything in Afghanistan, this is trust. So I think right now, for the moment, even though, this has been 19 years, a lot of people in the U.S. was born after the intervention started. But right now, the situation could potentially go way worse if they were to leave.
Okay, so let me ask you, Isidor, let me stay with you because you're sitting there in Europe. So obviously it's not just the U.S. that has been involved in Afghanistan. It has been European allies of the United States also, a part of this alliance and coalition that got involved there in Afghanistan militarily. How is Europe feeling about this? What are the discussions in Europe about this like? Because it seems for many people around the world, in fact, Afghanistan seems to fall off the radar, especially all these years after the involvement began.
Yeah, basically Europe is still terrified about what they did in Libya. This is a critical point. They fear like it was one of the worst interventions ever. Even though many European countries did not participate, they kind of supported other allies that participated. And they want to avoid having a second Libya at all costs, especially right now that they are facing all these immigration issues. They are facing a lot of instability coming from Middle East and Africa, but at the same time, they are facing internal instability. So they want to, if Afghanistan can be relatively controlled by the U.S., they prefer to keep it this way than throwing the dice and see what is going to happen if they leave.
Okay, so Michael, I wonder. Where do you think, this is a very macro question, but if we're looking back at the U.S. legacy and its coalition's legacy in Afghanistan, where did they go wrong, do you think, that so many years later the Kabul government is still in such a weak position that the Taliban doesn't even really recognize it, right? Because even this pact, in this pact, the Taliban is not required to actually recognize Ashraf Ghani's government at all. And there's really no guarantee that the Taliban will even go into talks with Ashraf Ghani, even though that's been spoken of after this deal is signed, that there may be talks in Oslo and Norway, which, mind you, Ashraf Ghani has not yet signed on to 100% either. What do you make of that?
Well, it certainly is not a very good situation in my judgment. Why did the United States go into Afghanistan some 18 years ago? Well, it was to drive the Taliban out and prevent them from controlling Afghanistan and providing free sanctuary to Osama bin Laden as he sat there and plotted and trained and carried out the operation, the execution of the attack on September 11th, 2001. Well, we did that in relatively short order. But of course, power abhors a vacuum. And if you just drive the Taliban out and then leave, the vacuum sucks in all kinds of people, including the al-Qaeda back in. So we stayed for 18 years in an effort to help Afghanistan to establish their government and to keep the Taliban at bay. Well, 18 years later, we're negotiating with the Taliban, and the particular points of contention are what are the terms and circumstances under which we will leave and give them free rein to come back into the country. It is just a mess. I do not believe that any promises we are able to extract out of the Taliban during the negotiation process will be honored by the Taliban once we leave. So this is, it's just a mess. I mean, Donald Trump's trying to get us out because he can't see an end. But the end is after we leave, and it goes back to the status quo before we went in. Quite a disastrous result, potentially, in my judgment, after 18 years.
Okay, so then, Isidor, I'll put the same question to you. What do you think went wrong here? Because if we are at this point, 18 plus years later, where even the U.S. Secretary of State is just so nervous about signing on to this deal, which has been reached, apparently after 9 rounds plus of talks with the Taliban, What does that say about U.S. strategy or just the lack of?
I think you said it. I think it's a lack of strategy right now. But I guess when they started the intervention, they kind of had a strategy, but this was wrong. This was badly planned. It was, we're going to go to Afghanistan. We're going to convince everybody that democracy is good, and they're going to follow us because what else they need? Well, things doesn't work like this there. I think right now, for sure, the Taliban are going to seek power. They had the power and they missed it because of they lost it because of a foreign intervention. So from their point of view, they are legitimate to recuperate the power. This implies that there has to be some kind of relations, power sharing between the US-backed Afghan government and the Taliban. And I don't think that this is going to happen, at least in the midterms. I think that basically United States thought that, by intervening in Afghanistan, people will really welcome them. Yeah. And they have realized that it's a country full of particularities. There is a lot of minorities that at the end of the day represent the majority of the Afghan people. So it's not clear whether, and right now Trump's policy, with John Bolton also advising, I'm not confident about it.
Michael, just that term US-backed when it comes to the Afghan government seems to be kryptonite for it, doesn't it? When it comes to this entire issue, it seems that just that term, again, that reality really, that this government in Kabul is so dependent on the United States and this coalition's help to just survive. What exactly do you think went wrong when it came to U.S. actions, then specifically on the ground in Afghanistan? We can probably go back to drone strikes and other abuses, which we can, I can list off of, and very well, of course, over these 18 years, there have been several missteps and major mistakes made throughout the country vis-a-vis human rights and otherwise, just on the part of U.S. forces and other coalition forces. Has that essentially just destroyed the reputation of whichever government comes in with the backing of this coalition?
Well, it makes it difficult without a doubt, but there were several things here that I think we need to acknowledge. The first is that the very first government that got in was rather ineffective and corrupt. Not something unusual for that region. Afghanistan's not had any experience with democracy, and people have a tendency to take advantage of the situation. Over the course of time, there have been military missteps. There have been new governments that have been elected, and I want to stress that the elections have been fairly successful and fairly widespread. There is not just U.S.-backed. A lot of this, of the government, at least, was backed by the people when they chose to participate in free and fair elections and put these people in power. But ultimately, over the course of time, everyone has just struck out. The governments that have been elected consist of really not president of Afghanistan, but more mayor of Kabul. And so they have a nice thing with U.S. security assistance. They have a nice thing going in the capital, but they control almost none of the land out in the countryside. And that's, it's been that way since day one, with a little bit of give and take, not much. And that's not really a national government.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there as a final word, but of course we appreciate Michael and Isidor for time to join us. Earlier, we were also joined by Zubair, who was joining us from Kabul. We appreciate their insight, of course. Viewers, as all of our guests are mentioned, when it comes to this deal, certainly there are many issues with it. And it's surprising, isn't it, that this is the deal that's been reached after 9 rounds of talks. There's no guarantees on the part of the Taliban even recognizing the Kabul government. How then will they negotiate as a next step if the deal is signed? If the U.S. actually signs on to this deal, will Ashraf Ghani even send a delegation to Oslo to discuss directly with the Taliban? We don't even know if that will occur that close to, of course, the elections, although Ghani is seemingly being pressurized into that. Then, of course, there's the legacy of the U.S., right? U.S.-backed government, as I put to Michael, that is kryptonite. That's something that no one wants to really be signing on to because the U.S. and coalition reputation throughout that country is destroyed because of its own actions, because of its own corruption. And we can list off, as I said to Michael, many, many examples of human rights abuses and just corrupt practices. A lot of people made a lot of money, a lot of arms industry manufacturers made a lot of money in Afghanistan, but yet the people have seen very little advantage to this continuing military involvement on the part of Western countries. We'll keep a very close eye on that situation and see how that develops in the coming days. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss in this segment the U.S. government watch list, terrorist watch list, to be more specific, includes at this point in time around more than 1 million people who've been identified as known or suspected terrorists. A judge has ruled that that violates everyone who is on that list, their constitutional rights, and that is a U.S. federal judge, mind you, who has ruled that way. The government says, and the FBI's lawyers have argued, that difficulties suffered by plaintiffs who are part of this lawsuit and who are on that list pale in comparison to the government's interests in combating terrorism. The FBI obviously disregarding human rights and a whole list of other issues that we can probably list off. The judge obviously disagreeing with that, saying, no, it's not okay for these people to be on that list, especially if many of them don't even know what exactly they're being accused of specifically and what actions they may have taken that may have even raised any suspicions to begin with, creating then obstacles for them to add borders, at border crossings, I should say, where they're now subject to invasive searches and otherwise. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're now joined by Amjid, Khazir, who is a counter-extremism expert. He's a director and founder of Media Culture at CIC. He specializes in countering extremism and promoting unity through education, inclusion, safeguarding, and equality programs. He's joining us now from Middlesbrough in the UK. We're also joined now by Dr. Steve Hewitt, who is at the Department of History and American and Canadian Studies Research Center at the University of Birmingham, I believe. He's joining us now from Birmingham itself. And we're also joined by Dr. David Lowe, who is Senior Research Fellow at Leeds Beckett University Law School, and he researches terrorism and security, policing, and criminal law. He's joining us now from Liverpool. David, Steve, and Amjid, thank you to all three of you for joining us. Steve, I'd like to start with you. We have spoken about terrorism watch lists, I believe, in the past with you as well, Steve, and just how this sort of targeting occurs, not just, of course, in the U.S. context, but possibly in Canadian context and otherwise. What do you make of this terrorism watch list, which was, as we well know, begun in the wake of 9/11?
Well, it just shows you how really shambolic the entire effort is. I mean, terrorist watch lists actually predate 9/11. I mean, they go back decades, I think to at least in the 1970s in the aftermath of the Munich Olympic attack. So what happens after 9/11 is the U.S. attempts to sort of centralize these lists. And you have this list that, as you mentioned in your introduction, has over 1 million names. And yet it's not clear that these people on the list, what criteria were applied to put them on. Many of them never been convicted of any crime, never accused of any crime. And so you have over 1 million people, including nearly 5,000 Americans, who are on this list who don't necessarily know they're on the list, other than they end up, receiving a very rough treatment, crossing borders, attempting to fly, things such as that.
Indeed. And David, I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because does any of this actually keep the U.S. homeland safe? I mean, is this the way to go about combating terrorism? The FBI, as you well know, has argued yes.
Well, watch lists are important, but there is a bonus to it. I think what is big concern is, and I'm going to emphasize again, what's the criteria for going on the watch list? And then on top of that, then there is, of course, the no-fly list. There aren't as many on a no-fly list as a watch list, but it's sharing this information that the US on their watch list, as you said, over 1 million people. So who do they share it with? Well, they're part of the Five Eyes, which is the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and of course the US. And then, of course, it's those who are, if you like, its allies. And again, you're looking at the UK, you're looking at Europe. No doubt they may send that list to Europol, which is the policing agency for the European Union. It's who they're sharing it with, but it's a criteria for going on. And, one of the things that comes out is being stopped at border controls. And for most states, border controls, there doesn't need to have that term reasonable suspicion. I mean, for example, here in the UK, we have Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, where what they're called port stops. But there has been changes in that because, there was no right to legal representation. So now there have been changes brought about through our judiciary here. So you need to have that criteria. And as I said, you do need it where you've got good suspicion of someone is involved. Because we're talking about international terror threats like Islamism. But what also concerns me is, well, how about other extremists and terrorists like the far right and so on? They don't seem to be on this list.
Amjid, I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because does any of this help the cause? Because the goal is to keep everyone secure, right? But then how does it help anybody if you're just basically, seemingly, just taking groups of people or anybody who raises any sort of suspicion and then essentially destroying their reputation? Because this watch list is not like it's kept private just with the FBI. It's shared with many, many governmental organizations across the United States. And many of these people then have their reputations destroyed because that sort of issue keeps coming up every time they've even just gotten something like a speeding ticket or otherwise. That red flag is raised every single time they're involved with any government organization.
Well, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with the colleagues and the comments they've just given. We have the judge making a summation that the overall brief for this screening database is overly broad and riddled with errors. And I'd just like to add that it's not just simply government agencies that have access to this information. It's actually, some reports say, up to 1,400 different institutions, including private organizations. And with the abuse of personal information being shared with foreign governments, the vast majority of this list is made up of Muslims and people from foreign nations. The abuse and the opportunity to develop a xenophobic practice within what you call security parameters is flawed from the very outset. So for the judge to have made this summation and make this judgment is not a surprise to me. But the continuation of such policies, as David has said, in the UK around Schedule 7, stop and search, historically, these policies where broad scopes and broad parameters have been placed on security, they've led to xenophobic and prejudicial-based stop searches, and that's exactly what's going to happen and has happened in America. And I think with the judgment and the efforts by CARE, and I think the likes of Congressman Ilhan Omar, who've said from 2006 that this issue is one of security and of being able to complete the due process correctly, and it's not going to happen with such broad security databases.
Steve, as you well know, the term now and the phrase "flying while Muslim" is, it's something that keeps going viral over and over again as there are more and more cases of people, going through invasive searches. And this doesn't, of course, just happen at U.S. airports, but happens at many airports around the world. And I've experienced some of that myself, and I'm sure many viewers have as well. Do you think that sort of broad prejudgment is helping really anybody in any regard when it comes to this situation of keeping any number of people secure in their respective countries?
No. And obviously I'm speaking not as a Muslim, I'm speaking as a privileged white male who never experiences that sort of harassment when you travel. But I mean, that just plays into this narrative of Islamophobia, but also stigmatizing people, of humiliating them. I mean, it is clearly counterproductive, and this is again part of the sort of broad sweep of the war on terror that we've had now nearly 18 years of. That we're no closer to an end of this. In fact, the numbers have increased. I mean, think from 2013 to 2017, the numbers on this list almost doubled. They went up several 100,000 in a 4-year period. So it's about time, really, that a judge, and this is a judge appointed by George W. Bush, by the way, this is not someone who's a quote unquote liberal judge. A judge has actually said, something needs to be done about this and done quickly.
Yeah. Okay, so David, then let's talk about what should be done. What does a logical policy on all of this look like, do you think? And I know it's a very specific question. I'm not asking you to give me a very detailed explanation, but I'm just asking, what would a better policy look like? Because again, this is not working. It's essentially sidelining Muslims / anybody who looks Arab or different, really, the other, if I may use that term. And what then does a more logical explanation or way of approaching this topic of terrorism watch list, especially at a time where far-right terrorism, too, is now surging?
Yeah. And there's other extremist causes, that are causing a problem. I think what the US and the international partners should do is get together and form an agreement. As I said earlier, there are benefits to having a watch list, but you look at individuals where they're associated with known terrorists, their movements are such there might not be sufficient evidence to arrest in that particular state at that stage. But there has to be something more concrete than just simply the fact that they may have said something outspoken or some minor thing that might put them onto a watch list. Because, as we were talking about here, it creates a suspect community, and we have an international suspect community. I can remember back to the Irish Troubles, there was a suspect community in the UK, which were Catholics of Irish-born Catholics or British-born Catholics of Irish parents, and they were regularly stopped. And you look at the fact we even went to internment at one stage on that. And so there has to be specific criteria. And also, over 1 million people on the list. How difficult is that for agencies to monitor? Let's have those who are really suspected but insufficient evidence to arrest at a stage. That would make it far easier and make it also safer for ourselves. And you're right, it isn't just the Islamist cause that's international. We're now seeing the far-right cause that's international. And for me, one of the paradoxes of the US is you have groups like the American Nazi Party who you can access in open sources. The party itself, and you look at other countries who are trying to deal with this.
Indeed. Okay, we'll have to leave that as a final word as the clock has gotten the best of us, but certainly just, gotten through a few very important points on this topic. I'd like to thank Amjid, Steve, and David for their time speaking to us all from the UK there this morning. We appreciate, of course, their insight. Viewers, as we've spoken about, and as Steve mentioned, of course, the honest truth is that when it comes to this watch list, it is made up, the vast majority of at least, of Muslims. So this goes back to that core issue of Islamophobia as well when approaching any issues of terrorism, especially in Western countries and especially in the United States in the wake of the 9/11 terror attacks there, or just Arab-looking or different-looking brown people, basically, if I may argue with that. So this is not really helping anybody, because how does sidelining a whole group of people and then subjecting them to invasive searches at border crossings throughout the Western world, how does that help anybody? How does placing them on no-fly lists without even telling them what they're accused of help anybody and keep anybody secure? Is this the best that the U.S. can do to keep its homeland secure? Certainly, somebody somewhere must have a better idea about how to keep the homeland secure, even from far-right terrorists, mind you. As I pointed out, that seems to be and is, when we look at the statistics, a much larger threat than any other form of terrorism at this time in the U.S. or otherwise. We'll keep a close eye on that issue here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In our final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the U.S. Defense Department, which has launched a new project to repel large-scale automated disinformation attacks. That's exactly how it describes it. And the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, a long name, wants software that can unearth fakes hidden among stories, photos, video, and audio clips. Now, basically, this is going back to this issue of fake news, something which Donald Trump, of course, has made viral as a term. But certainly it is a threat, at least from the U.S. perspective, seemingly, when we talk about election meddling back in 2016, alleged election meddling, I should say. Is this the way to go forward? Is AI, i.e. artificial intelligence, the way to detect fake news? Because fake news is such a subjective term, isn't it? When we talk about what news is truth and fact, or just pure lies. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. George Szamuely, who is an author and journalist, senior research fellow as well at the Global Policy Institute. He's joining us now from Budapest. George, as always, thanks for your time. What do you make of this sort of approach to fighting this issue of fake news?
Well, the last people that you would want to assign the role of deciding what is and what is not fake news is the Pentagon, and DARPA that you refer to is an agency of the Pentagon. Let us really look at the most egregious examples of fake news in recent times. The invasion of Iraq on the basis of completely bogus intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. The origin of this fake news about weapons of mass destruction was, of course, the US Defense Department. So when they talk about fake news, they don't actually mean the fake news that they put out. They mean the fake news that they don't like. The stories about US military activities that they don't like and that they want to eliminate from people's consciousness. So what they're trying to do is to go to the giant internet media companies. And we only have about 3-4 companies that control the flow of information globally, which is quite a shocking thing, and want to persuade them to adopt the Defense Department's criteria of what is and what is not news. I can't think of anything more alarming than that, and yet the mainstream media seem quite happy to go along with this.
Not just the mainstream media, right, George? I mean, it seems that these big tech companies are more than willing to play ball, aren't they? I mean, we've seen so many people's accounts suspended / blocked on social media just for posting different points of view.
Exactly. And what they do is say, well, we have just closed down several hundred media accounts or Facebook or Twitter accounts because they are bots or because they are agents of the Russian government or the Iranian government. But these are just simply assertions on their part. We have no means of judging this. We just simply have to take their word for it. And where are they getting their advice from as to what is and what is not a genuine site? Well, they're getting it from the Atlantic Council. Facebook has said one of their advisors for deciding what is and what isn't fake news is the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is a propaganda arm of NATO. It is funded, lavishly funded, may I say, by the Western governments, NATO governments. So in other words, Facebook is determining what is and what is not propaganda according to criteria set up by the Western governments that have obviously a vested interest in excluding from the public discourse points of view that they don't like.
And then this then goes directly then to the heart of the argument of democracy, doesn't it then, George? Because especially if this is meant to stop any form of election meddling by any external players who are trying to, influence any respective election, be it the US or otherwise, isn't a free exchange of ideas and criticism back and forth and debate part of the democratic process?
Of course it is. You are absolutely right. There is absolutely no reason why, even if it's true that these such sites or such characters were members of the Russian government or the Iranian government, there's no reason why they can't take part in public debate. After all, public debate doesn't exclude people. Well, you're not acceptable because you're from here or from there, whatever. It's part of debate. It's what we have to do is then reject views that we don't like, or we can dismiss as factually inaccurate evidence that really isn't evidence. What we can't do, and what we shouldn't do, as you say, in a democracy, is to rule people out ahead of time by saying that, you're actually a Russian, or you're Chinese. That just simply stifles debate. And then we only have, unfortunately, one point of view, and then we get disasters like the invasion of Iraq, in which alternative views, alternative positions saying, look, there's no evidence for Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. Those alternative views were simply ruled out, and no one heard them.
Exactly. And then as a final comment, then, George, I wanted to ask you then, do you think create even more of that bubble effect? I mean, where people in the Western world would then be even more within their bubble and cut off essentially from the realities on the ground around the world? Because, this is not just about elections, right? I mean, you can imagine that this sort of technology, if brought into force, or possibly if not already in force and in effect, would seek to keep them from the realities on the ground abroad, U.S. military adventures overseas, etc.?
Exactly. That is the very great danger. We will only get one-sided views about the Middle East. We will only get one-sided views about the supposed threat emanating from Iran. We will only get one-sided views about the danger of Russia. I mean, let's just take that as the example of Russia. All the stories that we have been hearing. Oh, Russia hacked the DNC server. Russia attempted to murder an ex-agent of theirs. These are all stories that have had a powerful poisonous effect on the Western foreign policy. And they're based on really nothing. They're based on simple assertions emanating from Western intelligence sources. Yeah. And so far, there's an alternative media that has been able to challenge some of these stories. But, if DARPA has its way, it's going to be that much more difficult to challenge these evidence-free assertions, which have a powerful and could have possibly disastrous effects on the world.
Indeed. All right, George, we'll leave it there at that. But of course, as always, we appreciate your time to speak to us. That was George Szamuely speaking to us from Budapest, sharing his expert insight on this issue. Certainly, this is worrying. Do we want governments involved in deciding what is or what is not fake news, especially a government like the U.S., which, as George correctly pointed out, has had many, many missteps in the past when it comes to just correct or information. Iraq WMDs is probably the biggest and most embarrassing example, but there are of course, many, many others as well. Do we really want that sort of big brother to be really ruling over what we see online and what we talk about and what we debate? Isn't free speech part of the democratic process? When we talk about election meddling, why not talk about proof of election meddling? And why not talk about, in fact, those lobbies which actually influence U.S. elections, such as the Israel lobby, which isn't spoken of enough in the mainstream? Why only talk about Russia or others that may possibly be trying to influence the election through lobbying powers or otherwise? We'll keep a very close eye on this because certainly this has grave consequences and impacts on all of us around the world and our free speech rights as we see it online. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.